Hi, my name is Zula Rabikowska and I'm a Polish documentary photographer based in London. I'm really excited to be showing two projects at the Baths. The first project is entitled BA LAN. BA LAN means Poland in Vietnamese, and this project focuses on the Vietnamese diaspora in Poland. The second project is called Tender Grounds, and this is a very different project using analog film photography, where I actually developed my own recipes using coffee, salt, and vitamin C, where I developed my film in organic materials. So both of these projects are on show. BA LAN is about the Vietnamese diaspora in Poland. The Vietnamese communities in Poland started to form in the 1950s. And the reason for this was the communist link between then communist government in Poland and Vietnamese communist government. Vietnamese students in Vietnam were rewarded with the opportunity of studying in many Eastern European countries like Poland or Czech Republic. So this was the reason why these communities started to form. In the 60s, 70s and 80s, these exchanges continued, and many of the students decided to stay behind. The Vietnamese diaspora in Poland is of a very different nature to, let's say, those communities in the United States or Australia, where predominantly, most of the time, they're a refugee origin. Those communities in Poland have a very different character, and right now we're looking at often third or even fourth generations of people who are Vietnamese but also Polish. And this project very much focuses on this dual, multiple identity. I also chose to integrate archival imagery into my project because the communist link is so important in this work. So you can see Vietnamese magazines, you can see photos of politicians from Vietnam who visited Poland in the 60s and 70s, heads of culture departments, letters. For the purpose of the exhibition and for the project, I also made my own paper. You can see this in the exhibition which displays the map. The paper was made from two different Vietnamese magazines, which were both printed in Poland, bringing and tying the story together. I carried out this project in 2019. Before heading out to Poland, which is where I'm from, I spent months in archives, the British Library, on the phone, sending emails, carrying out research in preparation for carrying out the practical side of this project. The practical side took me around a month. I spent the whole of August in 2019 in Poland working every day, and I worked with the community in Warsaw. The project brings together the stories of 30 different people, but throughout my research I was in contact with hundreds and hundreds of different individuals, organizations. It was really exciting and really rewarding to work with so many different people and to gain their trust and get them to share their story with me. One of the really rewarding elements of working in this project was gaining the trust of these different individuals and getting them to allow me and to access their private lives. These connections don't happen overnight, and they don't happen instantly. Before I started this project, I didn't know a single Vietnamese Polish person in Poland at all, and I started very much online. But my connections and friendships and relationships with this community started to form and formalize and kind of solidify once I got to Warsaw. And it was really rewarding and exciting in many ways. I started out meeting with people for coffee or for a beer, and then over time gaining their trust, being invited to parties, to hairdressing salons, to various events that I never thought or imagined that I would ever come along to. But being in someone's private space is definitely an experience. You have to be a very good listener. You have to be respectful. And one of the biggest challenges for me was how to adequately share the story of those people. So two of the things that I did was, the first one, I always photographed people in the place of their choice, whether it was their home, their place of work, or for example with Kim Lee, who is the only Vietnamese drag queen in Poland, he wanted to be photographed in his studio, so I photographed him there. The captions for these individuals that I photographed were based on conversations that we had, translated from Polish more often than not. But I then remained in touch with every single individual and went back and forth and actually included them in editing the texts that I use alongside these photographs. So I tried to make it as collaborative as possible. So the Vietnamese community, or Vietnamese communities in Poland, are of very complex nature. Some have been born in Poland and been living there for many decades. Some, like Mrs. Hien, whose portrait is on display at the exhibition, only moved to Poland 2 or 3 years ago and is still learning Polish. So it's really hard to say and lump such a diverse community from so many different backgrounds into one cohesive entity. But many of the individuals that I have met felt Polish, but also felt a sense that they were denied this feeling of being Polish or European because of their ethnicity. And more often than not, Polish society is very much depicted as a homogeneous white Catholic mass, which is not the case, because as with the example of the Vietnamese community, we can see that actually this country is more diverse than we're often led to believe. So I was the first photographer to carry out a documentary project in such a way on the Vietnamese diaspora in Poland. It's a topic that has been covered in academic writing, but nothing that was explored visually using photography the way that I had done. So the project received a lot of attention from Polish press, from British press, but also from Vietnam. So I was interviewed by the BBC early last year, but also I have found actually very recently, whilst doing a YouTube search, that I was featured on national live Vietnamese television, where the presenters were discussing my project in Vietnam, which was really super exciting to see. So one of the reasons I decided to carry out the project BA LAN was my personal experience as a migrant coming from Poland at the age of 10 and living in the UK. I very much grew up across 2 languages, 2 cultures, having one side of the family in Poland, the other side in the UK. And it was this place that led me to return to Poland and examine what it's like for others that might be in a similar situation to myself. So whenever meeting with different individuals from this community, I always started by making myself vulnerable first and sharing my own story before hearing those of other people. And that enabled me to create this connection. I was also frustrated by hearing my family, most of whom still live in Poland, repeating the slogans and the stereotypes that constantly appear in the media, which often demonize the other, in this case in Poland, at the moment being the Vietnamese communities, amongst other individuals and communities as well. So it was that frustration and desire to do something, to really look into the story, that encouraged me to start working with this community directly, rather than just relying on the information and the articles that I was constantly seeing. Some of the individuals that I worked with, so for example, Kim Lee, whose photo is on display, as well as Tomek, are really famous in Poland, and they have recently starred in a Netflix series, 1983, which takes place in a dystopian future, and there is a Vietnamese community in that series. However, what was frustrating for me, and definitely for the members of that community, is whenever Vietnamese individuals in Poland are cast in such shows, they're always cast in the same roles. Those of the mafia, those of market sellers, they're never protagonists, and they're always in the same kind of stereotypical representations. So in this project, I really was hoping to move beyond that, to shed a different light on what it's like to be part of this community, to exist across different languages, Vietnamese and Polish, and feel a split sense of identity. Before starting this project, I was very much warned by my family that no such individual would ever share their story with me. I was set up to fail before I even started, which determined me even further to carry this project out. When I got to Warsaw and when I started doing my research, I was welcomed with a completely different response. More often than not, the members of the Vietnamese community were often intrigued by why I wanted to do this project, but also excited and often very willing to share their story, as no one had ever, in Poland at least, been interested in their lives. So it was a really humbling position that I was in, suddenly to be a witness and almost like a transmitter for these stories, for these experiences. In some cases, it was really challenging, as I met people who, particularly those of older generations, who wanted to share their story with me, but were fearful and sometimes worried about the implications from the Vietnamese government currently. So for those individuals, I haven't included their stories to protect their identity, but our conversations definitely influenced how I approached the whole story and definitely encouraged me to include the archival imagery as well. Tender Grounds is a project I never really anticipated that I was going to make. It was a reactionary project that came about during lockdown, during coronavirus. I was stuck in my own flat with limited resources and loads of creative ideas. Something that always frustrated me about photography, particularly analog photography, so film photography, was the environmental impact. The fixers and developers and stoppers, subsystems which are used to develop photographic film, are often harmful to the environment. And to question that relationship, I decided to develop my own, based on household products that I could easily find in my home without going to the shop, which then I put together to develop my photos. And this is what I used to develop them, which you can see in the display at the baths. Tender Grounds is a play on words. Grounds refers to the physical environment, the earth that we walk on, but it also refers to the coffee grounds that I've used in the process itself. And I chose to use the word tender to explore further our relationship with the world around us and the environment. I've always been really interested in photography. Since a very young age, I was always very creative, but I never had the guts as an 18-year-old to study photography or anything arts related. I actually studied French and English and lived in France. I then lived in the French Caribbean, and that then took me on a trajectory where I worked as an English teacher abroad. I worked in China and South Africa and India, and I was always really interested in stories and connections and connecting with people. And I always did photography on the side. So after a few years, I decided that this is what I wanted to do, and I decided to retrain and reorganize my career. And I finished an MA in documentary photography at London College of Communication, which I finished last year. And that was really helpful, helped me make connections and really re-evaluate and reorientate my practice, helping me to become the photographer that I am today. I'm really interested in questions of identity, home, and belonging, and many of my past works touch upon those themes. In the future, I hope to return to Poland and carry on exploring those themes, but linked to my personal identity and my story. But definitely the work that I've carried out to this day has impacted me and shaped me in the way that I approach visual storytelling.